The Crusades. Before we begin, I would like to take note for everyone to please silence all cell phones and pagers. Thank you. From 1095 to 1272, an epic battle for the Holy Land took place. This was better known as the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of religion-driven military campaigns brought on by much of Christian Europe. The reason and cause of the Crusades was a war between Christians and Muslims, which centered on the city of Jerusalem and the holy place of Palestine. Crusades were fought mainly against Muslims, though campaigns were also directed against pagan Slavs, Jews, Russian and Greek Orthodox Christians, Mongols, Cathars, Hussites, Waldensians, Old Prussians, and political enemies of the popes. Crusaders took vows and were granted an indulgence for past sins. The Crusades originally had a goal of recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule, and were launched in response to a call from the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire for help against the expansion of the Muslim Seljuk Turks into Anatolia. There were a total of 9 crusades in all, but there were also the Children's Crusades that was included. People didn't realize how much these wars would cost, with a number of casualties and money to pay for the wars. It all began with the First Crusade. The First Crusade took place 1095 to 1099. This crusade could also be known as the Youths Crusade, which means that majority of the knights were pretty young when they started. You could call it a youth movement, but in different terms. In other words, the condition of a Youths was not necessarily that he was young. What mattered was that, although knighted, he had yet to establish himself as the head of a family of his own. These youthful and brave knights joined forces to take on the Turks in the First Crusade. The immediate cause of the First Crusade was the Byzantine Emperor Alexius. I appealed to the Pope Urban II for mercenaries to help him resist Muslim advances into territory of the Byzantine Empire. Pope Urban II called upon all Christians to join a war against the Turks, promising those who died in their conquest would receive immediate remission of their sins. Recruits came in greater numbers from France than from any other country, a circumstance that resulted in the Crusaders being generally called Franks by their Muslim foes. They had no single commander, but each contingent set out for Constantinople by its own route and at its own time. The siege of Antioch took place shortly before the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. Antioch fell to the Franks in May 1098, but not before a lengthy siege. The Jews and Muslims fought together to defend Jerusalem against the invading Franks. They were unsuccessful though, and on July 15, 1099, the Crusaders entered the city. They proceeded to massacre the remaining Jewish and Muslim civilians and pillaged or destroyed mosques in the city itself. This was only the beginning of the legendary battle for the Jerusalem, and this is when many people made a name for themselves. You can hear about the Youths or heroes through different stories that made it back to the small towns after the war. There was so much action that occurred during this crusade that there was a little break until the Second Crusade began. After a period of relative peace in which Christians and Muslims coexisted in the Holy Land, Muslims conquered the town of Edessa. The Second Crusade took place from 1147 to 1149. French and South German armies under the King Louis VII and Conrad III respectively marched to Jerusalem in 1147 but failed to win any major victories. Damascus was an independent city that would fall into the hands of Nur ad-Din, the main enemy of the Crusaders. On the other side of the Mediterranean, great success took place as a group of northern European crusaders stopped in Portugal, allied with the Portuguese king Alfonso I of Portugal, and retook Libsyn from the Muslims in 1147. The Third Crusade took place from 1187 to 1192. This crusade is known as King's Crusade. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem following the Battle of Haiti. After taking Jerusalem back from the Christians, the Muslims spared civilians and for the most part left churches and shrines untouched to be able to collect ransom money from the Franks. When news broke of Saladin's victories, it shocked Europe. To lead this crusade was Richard I of England. also known as Richard the Lionheart. The Crusader army headed south across the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and they defeated the Muslims near Arsa, recaptured the port city of Jaffa, and were inside of Jerusalem. However, Richard did not believe he would be able to hold Jerusalem once it was captured, as the majority of Crusaders would then return to Europe, and the crusade ended without the taking of Jerusalem. Richard left the following year after negotiating a treaty with Saladin, which allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims to make trips from the Holy Land, while it remained under Muslim control. On his return from the Holy Land, King Richard's ship crashed off the coast of the Adriatic in Austria. He tried to travel through Austria in disguise, but was captured by the Duke of Austria, whom he had offended at the siege of Acre. The king regained his liberty only by paying a ransom equivalent to more than twice the annual revenues of England. Pope Innocent III initiated the Fourth Crusade in 1202. This crusade only lasted for 2 years. Pope Innocent III had the intention of invading the Holy Land through Egypt because the Crusaders lacked the funds to pay for the fleet and provisions this time around. The Venetians agreed to furnish the necessary ships only on condition that the Crusaders first seized Zara on the eastern coast of the Adriatic. Zara was a Christian city, but it was also a naval and commercial rival of Venice. The Crusaders took Constantinople by storm. They burned down a great part of it, and they slaughtered the inhabitants. They destroyed monuments, statues, paintings, and manuscripts, the accumulation of 1,000 years. Then it was the children's turn to take part in the Crusades. It took place right in between the Fourth and Fifth Crusade. The Children's Crusade occurred in 1212 thanks to Pope Innocent III. He was the main cause of this crusade to take place, and he led a gathering of children in France and Germany. The leader of the French army, Stephen, led 30,000 children. The leader of the German army, Nicholas, led 7,000 children. None of the children actually reached the Holy Land, and those who did not return home or settle along the route to Jerusalem either died from shipwreck, hunger, or were sold into slavery in Egypt or North Africa. The children's expedition was the decline of the crusading movement. The fanatic zeal that inspired the first Crusaders was already dying out. "These children," said the Pope, referring to the young Crusaders, "reproach us with having fallen asleep, whilst they were flying into the assistance of the Holy Land." There were 3 different phases with the Fifth Crusade. In the first phase, a crusading force from Austria and Hungary joined forces to take back Jerusalem. In the second phase, Crusader forces achieved a remarkable feat in the capture of Damietta in Egypt in 1219. Damietta is a port and the capital of Domiat, Egypt. Its location sits between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile River. While the armies were in Damietta, one saint who did something amazing for the Crusaders was Saint Francis. The earliest account appears in a letter in the spring of 1220, written by James of Vitry, who himself was with the crusading army at Damietta. James mentioned Francis's visit in passing and restricted his report to the basic facts. While there, the Francians' master, who was also the founder of their order, came to stay with our army. He was not afraid to go into the camp of our enemy, burning with zeal for the faith. For several days he preached the word of God to the Saracens, but with little success. However, the Sultan, the king of Egypt, secretly begged him to pray for the Lord for him, so that by divine inspiration he might adhere to that religion which was more pleasing to God. But if anything at all can be said about the visit to Damietta, is that Francis didn't go to Damietta to stop the Fifth Crusade, because his overall objective was the same as that of the Crusaders. Francis, like the Crusaders, wanted to liberate the holy places in Palestine from Muslim rule. He wanted their total submission to Christian faith, but that didn't happen. After the capture of the port, they launched an attack on Cairo in July of 1221. But a nighttime attack by the ruler of Egypt, the powerful Sultan Al-Kamil, resulted in a significant number of Crusader losses, and it eventually led to the surrender of the army. After the battle, Al-Kamil agreed to an 8-year peace agreement with Europe. In the end, the Crusaders and St. Francis couldn't pull off a victory, but they at least got a peace agreement out of it. The Sixth Crusade was next in line, but it didn't last for that long. The Sixth Crusade only lasted a year, from 1228 to 1229. Since this crusade was only a year, it may seem like nothing happened, but that is not the case. Emperor Frederick II had repeatedly vowed a crusade but failed to live up to his word. Pope Gregory IX then excommunicated him in 1228. For Gregory, the crusade was just a useful excuse to excommunicate the emperor, whose Italian ambitions he feared. Frederick attempted to negotiate with the Pope, but eventually decided to ignore him, and sailed to Syria in 1228, despite the excommunication, arriving in Acre in September. While in Acre, Frederick II successfully